This is the 10th year after my death. After 10 years I finally saw the first person to visit my grave. The man limping toward me was my father. I am dead, but I've forgotten how I died. After my death, my soul floated in the air, unable to leave the 10-meter radius of my grave. It took me only 3 days to transition from confusion to acceptance. On the first day, I carefully read my tombstone. Carved on it were a few words: the grave of Su Hen. Beside those words was a date, and beneath the date, in small letters, daughter of Su Gi. Su Gi was my father. I tried hard to recall memories of my life, and all of them were filled with my father. I didn't like him. He was full of flaws: a chain smoker, a drunkard, a man who cursed constantly, had an overwhelming need for control, looked fierce and intimidating, and had a severe tendency toward violence. He believed violence could solve everything. When I was 5, I forgot what caused it, but late one night, he took me to a small clinic. I had a broken hand. The pain made my lips tremble and tears silently streamed down my face. He stood at the doorway, impatient and irritable, watching me. The nurse, her back to him, asked me softly, "Who is he to you?" I answered, "My dad." In that instant, the nurse's gaze at me became even stranger. Years later, when I looked back, I realized it was pity. The doctor set my bone, then directed me to find my father. Smoking was prohibited in the clinic, but he insisted on smoking and was eventually sent to the corner. I saw him sitting there, slumped with no sense of decorum, puffing away. The cheap cigarette smoke filled the space, its smell unbearable. Why did it have to be a girl? If only it were a boy. At 5 years old, I hadn't yet heard of the term son preference, nor did I have any concept of it, but I remembered his words forever, and I remembered the irritation in his tone. He wasn't tall, only 1.6 meters, with a stocky build and exaggerated muscles, especially on his arms. He always had a buzz cut and a face that never smiled. Even when expressionless, he looked intimidating. From as far back as I can remember, he always had a cigarette in his hand. They were gifts from friends. He had thick skin and lots of friends, but most of the cigarettes were cheap with an unbearable stench. He liked drinking, and when drunk, he'd go on a rampage, muttering incoherent words. His already terrifying face twisted and contorted, like a wild beast. We lived in a one-room place then. I, as a child, would stand in the corner of the room, watching him smash things in his drunken rage. There wasn't much for him to smash, just some old furniture he had scavenged from who knows where. I would wait until he was tired of smashing, until he fell asleep, and only then would I breathe a sigh of relief and quietly go to bed myself. I didn't go to kindergarten. I went straight to primary school. Before school, I stayed home all the time. He wouldn't allow me to go out. Whenever I wanted to step outside, he'd glare at me, his fierce expression making it seem like he'd hit me any second. His voice was coarse and unpleasant. What's so great about going out? Yet he was out all day, sometimes even not coming home until the next morning to keep me from leaving. He locked the door. He would leave some food at home, a few steamed buns, vegetable-filled dumplings, and water. When he returned, he'd check if I had eaten. If I hadn't, he'd glare at me, insisting I eat everything in front of him. I didn't like it. I didn't like chives, didn't like garlic, but I feared him more, so I forced myself to swallow, holding back the urge to GAG. And my father often had injuries, new ones layered over old ones. These were from fights. I had seen him fight before. That day, after I cautiously asked several times, he finally reluctantly took me out. It was to the place where he worked. There were many people like him there, some taller, some bulkier, with more muscles, and right in front of me he got into a fight with someone. Just a second ago, they were laughing and chatting, and the next moment he raised his fist and they were grappling in a brawl. His movements were fierce and brutal, his entire face twisted in anger. Perhaps fists weren't satisfying enough as he picked up a wooden stick. Luckily, someone managed to stop him in time. He was covered in wounds, with fresh blood streaming down his arms and face. It was as if he didn't even notice. The person he fought was in even worse shape, lying on the ground, unable to stand. He had to be helped up by others, and my father spat viciously at the man, then turned and dragged me away forcefully. I was already terrified, my face pale and legs weak. I managed not to fallonly by running the whole way. When we got back, I didn't dare say a word. My father's face was dark and brooding. He didn't even look at me. At 8, almost 9 years old, I finally entered primary school IN class. I kept to myself, invisible and unnoticed. I loved reading, and I loved the teachers who cared about me. After my father came to the school a few times, his appearance and crude words made the teachers feel even more pity for me. By middle school, because of my personality, I was ostracized by my classmates. I overheard them speaking ill of me behind my back, but I didn't care. Growing up in my environment had dulled my emotions. My father's demands of me grew stricter. Skirts, shorts, or short sleeves, I wasn't allowed to wear any of them. If I secretly bought them, he would twist his face in anger and tear them apart right in front of me. After school, I had to go home immediately. He installed surveillance cameras to monitor me. If I was late, I'd face a barrage of crude interrogation once he got home. This suffocating environment felt inescapable. But it was also my father who prevented me from experiencing physical violence during middle school. My silence and inaction made me an easy target. Until one day my father came to school for something. He stood behind me, glaring fiercely at everyone in the class. After that day, the bullying stopped at just verbal insults. Because I had a father who looked like he could kill someone the next second. In high school, I chose one where I had to live on campus. Finally, I could breathe. I tried to blend into my surroundings and even made a friend to talk to. I went home once every 2 weeks. I didn't see him much anymore. After that, it was time for the college entrance exams. Once the exams ended, my memories stopped. It feels like I've forgotten so many things. No matter how much I try to recall, I can't remember. On the 10th year after my death, I finally saw the first person to visit me. It was my father, but he wasn't the same father from my memories. He had aged a lot, walking with a limp and looked weathered like an old man. I saw him cry. That was something I'd never seen in my memories. Sweetie, those bastards are dead. All of them are dead. After saying this, he covered his face and sobbed bitterly, tears streaming uncontrollably. He cried like a child, and my father wept by my grave for a long, long time, as if trying to pour out a lifetime of tears. When he finished crying, he looked even older standing in front of my grave. He looked like a gust of wind could blow him away. In my memories, he was strong, able to knock down taller, bigger men with a single punch. He stayed by my grave the entire night. He said, "Your dad isn't a good person, so in your next life, be born into a normal family. At the very least, find someone who loves you, someone who won't make you suffer." I couldn't answer him. I could only watch him talk to himself. At dawn, he got up and walked away. I tried following him and found that I could leave the fixed radius of my grave. I looked back at my grave once, then continued to follow him. The area was remote and we walked a long time before seeing anyone. I saw a father and daughter laughing together, but when they saw my father, their faces changed, fearful and wary. I heard their hushed whispers, "That's him, the one who killed someone 10 years ago. They say he hacked the man into pieces. Then he turned himself in? Yeah. They say he did it for his daughter." Their voices faded as they walked away. I looked back, then continued to follow my father. He limped back to our home. After I graduated from elementary school, we had some money and my father moved us here. I went to look at my old room. Nothing in the room had been touched. It was exactly as I remembered. Leaving my room, I pushed open the door to my father's room. The first thing that caught my eye was a note in a prominent spot. No more fights, and definitely no criminal records. Sweetie wants to take the civil service exam. The handwriting was terrible, like that of a child, but I could imagine how serious I must have been when writing it. I rummaged through my father's desk and found a notebook. Opening it, I saw a crooked line of text on the first page. May 14th, I saw my flower. If you could go back, what time would you return to? Suddenly, a voice echoed in my mind. It said it was entrusted by my father. Grant me one wish. When my father was 8 years old, I want to see his childhood. Alright, it agreed. The next moment I opened my eyes, I was standing on the streets of Chingsha town. It was a desolate place with no one around. This was where my father had lived as a child. He had never told me about his past, but from bits and pieces others mentioned, I had guessed his childhood wasn't easy. My father lost his father at 5 and at 6, his mother abandoned him. No one wanted to take him in. He survived on his own. When I found him, he was crouched in a corner, devouring food. It was a filthy steamed bun suji. For the first time, I called his name. He turned, his wary eyes fixed on me. "I'm your father's friend and will also be your guardian. Why should I trust you?" At that moment, I couldn't see any trace of an 8-year-old in him. He was overly mature. The hardships and pain he had endured had left him with nothing but suspicion for the world. I couldn't convince him to trust me, but I could use the few dozen yuan I had on me to take him for a proper meal. At the table, I watched him gulp down noodles, finishing the entire bowl in less than 2 minutes. I pushed my untouched bowl toward him. He looked at me like I was a fool. "I'm not hungry," I said. He didn't reply, just picked up my bowl and continued eating. Soon, that bowl was empty too. "Still hungry?" I asked. "No, He replied. He casually wiped his mouth with his arm. Have you been hungry for a long time? I asked, what do you think? His voice was still sharp. No one cares if I live or die, where would I get food to eat? He was just an 8-year-old child without basic skills to work or survive. What did you eat before? Whatever I could find. If I couldn't find anything, I'd go hungry. He spoke in a tone of indifference. Come with me. I can make sure you don't go hungry. He looked at me, clearly tempted, but still said, think it through. I'm just a burden. It's fine. I was a burden to him for over a decade, too. He took me to his home. It was simple, the kind of place where rain would leak in. You can still back out now, he said, trying to sound casual. I won't. I didn't know everything he had endured, but I knew that later in life he never let me live like this. Suit yourself, he muttered, then made me a makeshift sleeping spot, an old straw mat spread on the floor. I said nothing and spent the night on that mat. The next day, in his I knew it expression, I gave him money for breakfast and lunch. I told him I was going to find work. I was essentially undocumented here, but after some clumsy explanations, a restaurant agreed to take me in. The pay wasn't much and the work was endless. But I agreed because I needed money, a lot of it, and my father never had a day of school. I wanted him to experience it. Just like he once juggled 3 jobs in a day, running himself into the ground so I could have proper documentation and attend school normally. The boss, perhaps out of pity, paid me half my wages daily with the rest at the end of the month. By the time night fell completely, I was heading back with half a day's wages in my pocket. When my father saw me return, he was surprised that I took out the meal the boss had packed for me and invited him to eat. While eating, he glanced at me several times. Where are you working? I want to go too. They don't hire kids there. He looked disappointed. Do you want to study? I asked. As long as you want, I'll support you until you're grown. I don't want to. He shook his head. No, you do. I had seen him carefully pick up my books, handling them as if they were precious. Back then, his eyes held a glimmer of hope. No matter how hard or exhausting it was, he made sure I started school at 8. But it costs a lot of money. I'm not sure I can do it. I'll handle the money, you just focus on studying. If you can't do well, that's fine too. The first time I failed an exam in middle school, I cried, and he caught me. He looked impatient at the time. It's just bad grades. What's the big deal? As long as you don't regret it, it's fine. He was moved. The next day, I went to work as usual. During work, I asked my boss about the nearest elementary school. After finishing the lunch rush, I had an hour-and-a-half break. I took time off and visited the school my boss mentioned. Perhaps I was lucky. When I was stopped at the school gates, I met a teacher. The teacher brought me inside, explaining the school situation and fees. Under the 9-year compulsory education policy, tuition was free. They only charged for meals and boarding. I decided to ask my father later whether he wanted to board or commute. I arranged to meet the teacher at the same time tomorrow at the school gates to finalize things. That evening, I told my father about it. I didn't explain much, just asked if he wanted to live at school. Doesn't it cost less not to board? I nodded. He chose to walk to school instead. The next day, I brought him to meet the teacher at the school gates. After paying 200 yuan for meals, I successfully enrolled him in the school. The school was a bit far from home, about a half-hour walk. Every morning I'd slip him a few yuan for breakfast and dinner. But he wouldn't take it, insisting on waiting for me to eat together. Every evening when I came back, he'd be sitting at the door doing homework and waiting for me. Less than a week into work, I was followed. That day, the restaurant was busy. Just before closing, a large group of customers came by the time they finished eating, it was an hour past closing. The boss, knowing my struggles, packed some food for me as usual and gave me a little extra pay as I left the restaurant. I walked through the dark night with a flashlight in hand. A shadow quietly trailed behind me. I glanced back but couldn't make out his face. I quickened my pace, and so did he. I slowed down and he did the same. There was no one else around. Panic set in. Then another beam of light appeared. I saw Su Ji, 8-year-old. Su Ji, holding a sharp knife, his gaze fierce as he stared at the person behind me. Come here, he said to me. I walked over and he pulled another dagger from his pocket. That moment, I felt a wave of relief. The shadow seemed to notice the knife, hesitated briefly and then turned to leave. Why are you here? I asked him. You were late coming back. Those words overlapped with my memories. He had said the same thing when I was half an hour late coming home once. Back then, his tone had irritated me, but now, 8-year-old him looked serious, like a little adult. Do you know how dangerous this place is? There are plenty of people like that here. If something happens, no one will help you. The restaurant was busy today. I got off late. I instinctively explained. He frowned. Then from now on, I'll pick you up after work. You wait for me there. I disagreed. You're just a kid. It's dangerous for you at night too. He sneered. I grew up in this place. What kind of danger haven't I seen? I've witnessed 3 murders. The dead are dead, the killer's caught. Things like that will keep happening. If you don't have the ability to survive here, you rely on luck. And to everyone here, women are the weakest. The ones with the least ability to protect themselves. He looked at the knife in my hand, his fierce tone overlapping faintly with the hymn from decades later. Take this knife. If anyone tries to bully you, stab them to death. In that moment, I suddenly began to understand the father who believed violence could solve everything. Because this was how he had survived. I meant what he said. The next day, near the end of my shift, he showed up with his school bag. When he saw me cleaning up the last bit of the restaurant, he didn't say anything. He put down his school bag and started helping me. The boss thought he was my younger brother, smiling as he praised me for having such a good sibling. After work, he walked behind me, knife in hand. Every time I turned around, I could see him. I suddenly remembered a time in 5th grade. Nervously, I had told my father that I thought a shadow had been following me. He didn't say anything. Just when I thought he didn't believe me, he appeared at the school gates the next day after school. I walked toward him, but he told me not to follow him. Go home by yourself. As I walked home, he trailed behind me, keeping his distance. He followed me like that for a month. A month later, he caught the person who had been following me, but even after that, he didn't stop. He followed me for another month. Later, I learned that he had been giving up his dinner time, eating just a steamed bun in the afternoon and running, drenched in sweat, to the school gates. He would watch me get home safely before running back. He never told me any of this. Little Suji said he would pick me up from work, and he never missed a day. A few days later, he woke up early, insisting on walking me to work. He was afraid something might happen to me on the way. You don't have to do this. I'll be fine. But every day, he walked me to work and then went to school himself. A round trip took him over an hour. If something happens to you, I'll have to go back to the life I had before. He said this, carrying his school bag, knife gripped tightly in his hand, walking behind me. I had nothing to say. After dropping me off at work, he looked at me as if making a firm decision. In my heart, a voice told me, you're important. Extremely important, so you can't have anything happen to you, absolutely nothing. I froze, watching his figure, school bag on his back, grow smaller and smaller. I didn't even know how I ended up inside the shop. The boss's surprised voice brought me back to reality. What's wrong with you? Why are you crying? I raised my hand and felt the cold wetness on my face. Whenever Suji didn't understand something in his studies, he would ask me directly. Although he was in 1st grade, the semester was already halfway through. Catching up with the teacher's pace was proving to be very difficult. Under the warm yellow light, I watched him write crooked marks that couldn't even be called letters, but he was earnest, pressing hard with the pencil. I want to raise a dog. Is that okay? After writing, he looked up at me. Sure. Aren't you going to ask me why? Why? I asked. In a surprisingly mature tone, he explained his plan. If we have a dog, it can guard the house. Then we'll get one, I agreed. Even though buying a dog would cost quite a bit, I said yes, just like he had once said yes to me. When I was little, I was so scared of him that I didn't dare ask for anything. Not until middle school, when I was forced to speak up for the first time, did I realize it wasn't that hard. As long as I asked, he would always try to give it to me. Even if he didn't have it, he would find a way to get it for me. The day after I agreed, he brought back a dog, a skinny little black one. Is this one okay? He asked. After I nodded, he took the dog to wash it. From that day on, he made time every night to train the dog. Before going to bed, he'd lock the door, tie the dog inside and say, if there's any noise outside, it'll bark right away. He patted the little black dog's head and said, we'll call him Xiao Hei. I nodded. That very night, Xiao Hei barked. When I woke up, my groggy eyes opened to the sight of Suji crouched by the door, knife in hand. Xiao Hei was by his side, quietly staying put, no longer barking. In the absolute silence, I heard the faintest noise at the door. Suddenly, Suji thrust the knife through the crack in the door. Fast and ruthless. A scream erupted outside, followed by the sound of panicked footsteps. Suji stood up and turned around, seeing that I was awake. Go back to sleep. I'm here. Those words gave me a sense of reassurance that was hard to describe. I thought of the time in High school, when he had reluctantly allowed me to board at school. He had patted my shoulder and said, "If anyone bullies you, tell me first thing. I'll deal with them." And he really had. Suji, do you know anyone with the last name Tang? I asked during dinner. He shook his head in confusion. I didn't say anything else. I wanted to find someone, the person my father had cried about in the end, saying he had failed to protect my mother. I tried to look for families with the last name Tang. Unexpectedly, a matchmaker came to my house instead. The matchmaker dragged a man along with her. Gi had been doing his homework, but he stopped as soon as they entered. In all the years I'd lived, this was the first time I'd encountered something like this. My heart was filled with strong resistance, especially because of the way the man was looking at me. It made me uncomfortable in an instant. Yes, I was thinking of how to refuse. Suji stepped in front of me. He had always been blunt when speaking. "No need to look anymore, she doesn't like it, you can leave." His words were interrupted. The matchmaker, clearly displeased, scolded, "Su Hen, this child has no sense of propriety, and you just going to let her behave like this? If you don't like it, you can leave." I said this very directly. The matchmaker's expression changed. She muttered several times about how ungrateful I was. Before Suji could reach for a knife, she left with the man in tow. "There's no one decent around here. If you really want to get married, you'd better look elsewhere." He locked the door and said with utmost seriousness, "Fine, I'll agree, but I won't look for anyone and I won't get married." After the matchmaker left, Suji didn't return to his homework. He pulled out a knife and a dagger. Crouching on the ground, sharpened them repeatedly until he was satisfied with how sharp they were. Then he tied 2 wooden sticks together, fashioning a crude cross and standing it in the room. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I'm practicing how to fight. I want to get stronger. I know which parts of a person hurt the most when hit." Only at this moment, his voice carried a bit of a child's pride. "You're really impressive." I tried hard not to let my true emotions show. I could even imagine how many injuries he had suffered behind those words. How could an 8-year-old child know these things? He had learned them through being beaten and bullied. "Do you want to learn? I can teach you." Looking into his eyes, some of the blurriest fragments of my memory suddenly became clearer. Someone had once asked me, "Do you want to learn? I can teach you." "Okay," I agreed. He tried earnestly to teach me. Just a single over-the-shoulder throw, and I was on the ground. My vision blurred and overlapped. I heard his panicked voice calling my name repeatedly. My surroundings faded, but I saw the extreme panic and regret in his eyes, the same look from that night when I was 5 years old. "I'm fine," I said, not wanting him to worry so much. I grabbed his hand, smiled awkwardly and said, "Really, I'm fine. I'm not hurt and it doesn't hurt at all. Let's go to the clinic. We'll have it checked." He was so anxious he was crying. I sat up from the ground, trying to show him I was okay. But in the end, he still dragged me to the clinic. It wasn't until the doctor confirmed that I was perfectly fine that he finally felt relieved. On the way home, he kept his head down. Once we got back, he stood in front of me and apologized with guilt written all over his face. "I'm sorry. It's not your fault," I told him. He frowned deeply, troubled. "Why are you a girl? If only you were a boy." I froze. His words overlapped with my memory, back to that corner filled with the stench of cheap cigarettes. He had said the same thing. "Why is it a girl? If only it were a boy." I had never asked back then, but now, I asked softly, "Why? If you were a boy, I could teach you how to protect yourself, how to fight back. The dangers boys face in this place are far fewer than what girls have to deal with, but you're a girl, fragile like a flower. It's just not safe here." After he finished, his frown deepened. "But don't worry. I'll protect you." He promised me seriously, "No, this time, I'll protect you." He had protected me for over a decade. This time, I wanted to protect him. In the 10 years since rejecting the matchmaker, rumors around the town only grew. There were even people suggesting I marry into their families. I didn't care about the gossip, nor would I agree to anyone. I had a plan in my heart. Once I found my mother and saved enough money, I would take my father and leave this place. Before leaving for good, I wanted to see someone I had never met. If they were living, well, I wouldn't disturb them. So far, I only had 2 pieces of information. She had the last name Tang, and she had a dog bite scar in the inside of her left arm. There were no families with the surname Tang in this town. I started looking in the neighboring town. When Suji found out, he helped me search. During this time, I began trying to figure out how to be a parent. I thought seriously about it for a long time, but still felt clueless. I wanted him to grow up like other ordinary 8-year-olds, no fighting, no swearing, just studying and playing freely. But given the environment, those were survival skills he needed to stay safe. So, I asked him seriously, what do you want? He didn't understand why I was asking, but he still answered earnestly, I know I'm a burden now, but I'll grow up quickly, really quickly. When I grow up, when I have money, I'll take care of you for the rest of your life, really, I won't lie to you. Please don't leave me. I can stop studying. I can live on 2 steamed buns a day. I just want to tell everyone that I'm not alone. I have a family. Someone who waits for me at home. I'm not a child abandoned and unwanted by anyone. That day, his eyes turned red. I couldn't hold back my tears either. I hugged him, my voice trembling as I spoke through sobs. You are wanted. You do have a family. You can rest assured I won't leave. I'll stay with you as you grow up. Don't listen to what those people say. You're very important, so important that there are people in this world who would come here just for you. I kept learning how to be a parent. I helped him with his homework under the warm light of our dinner table. Wherever a parent's signature was needed, I signed my name carefully. When it was time for parent-teacher conferences, I sat in his place. 2 months after I arrived, Suji finished his first semester. I moved with him to a new place. Not too far but closer to the school compared to Chingsha town. This place was a little safer. As time went on, his face gradually showed more smiles. For his 9th birthday, I bought a cake. He stared at it curiously for over 10 minutes, as if discovering a new world. After that, I would occasionally bring home small cakes. The restaurant boss learned about my language skills. When his friend needed to hire someone for a related job, he recommended me. Even though I was still undocumented, the restaurant boss trusted me a lot, and his friend had a good first impression of me. That's how I got a new job. I continued searching for someone with the surname Tang. I found many, but none had a dog bite scar on their arm. They weren't the person I was looking for. Until the day of Suji's elementary school graduation, he brought home a girl about his age. Her last name was Tang and her name was Zhao Di. The moment I saw her, I was startled by a long scar on her face. She had thick, long bangs, but they couldn't fully cover the scar. Her eyes, hidden beneath her bangs, looked timidly at people. I turned a questioning look to Suji. He looked a bit embarrassed. I accidentally bumped into her. I am fine, the girl said softly as Suji didn't agree. You probably hurt your arm. I'll put some medicine on it for you, then walk you home. He ran into his room, coming out with a few bills in his hand. Take this. It's my compensation. This was something the old Suji would never have done. His current environment had taught him that when you make a mistake, you make amends. I noticed the girl's nervousness and the longing in her eyes for that money, even though it wasn't much, just a few dozen yuan. Take it, I said. I'll treat your wound too. The scar on her face made my voice gentler. Thank you, she said, taking the money. Her wound was on her elbow. As she rolled up her sleeve, I saw the scrape and bruises on her arm, and I saw a dog bite scar that had likely been there for years. I froze. What's your name? Tang Zhao Di, the girl replied softly. Everything matched. I looked at her face and could faintly see traces of myself. But I wasn't as thin and malnourished as she was. The person I had been searching for. I had finally found her, but now I didn't know how to talk to her. This was my first time meeting her. After all, are you doing well? There was no need to ask the question. Her name, the scar on her face, her malnourished body, and her timid eyes that couldn't meet anyone else's gaze, already said everything. Asking further would only reopen her wounds. I carefully applied the medicine, covered it with a bandage, and reminded her to avoid water for the next few days. She nodded silently, saying nothing. After treating the wound, I lowered her sleeve. Dinner is almost ready. Why not stay and eat before leaving? She shook her head, looking anxious. I have to go. If I don't leave now, it'll be too late. With that, she clutched her school bag and ran out of the house. She probably had something important to do. I found myself staring in the direction she had left. She's the person I've been looking for, I told Suji as I turned my gaze back. He didn't understand why I was looking for her, but he nodded and promised to keep an ear out for news about her. The next time I saw Tang Zhao Di was a month later. I was walking home after buying groceries when I saw her, head lowered, wandering aimlessly. I called out to her. As I got closer, I realized she was crying. Tears were dripping to the ground, one by one. Did something happen at home? She kept her head down, saying nothing. If you don't know where to go, come home with me. It's not safe for a girl to be outside alone. Before this, Suji had been trying to gather information about her. She came from a typical family that favored boys over girls. The entire household revolved around her younger brother. She was treated as nothing more than a laborer. Tang Zhao Di still said nothing, but her tears continued to fall silently. I thought for a moment and gently took her hand. She looked up, revealing her scarred face and tear-filled eyes. Come with me, I said, my voice even softer. She didn't say anything, but she also didn't pull her hand away. When we got home, Suji had already prepared dinner. Seeing Tang Jiao Di with me, he was a bit surprised, but he didn't ask any questions. He simply brought out an extra set of bowls and chopsticks. I took her to the bathroom first, wiped away her tears, and then brought her to the dining table. Let's eat. She picked up her bowl and ate quietly. Her tears still fell, but not as much as before. After finishing, she looked at me, bowed deeply, and said softly, "Thank you." That night, Tang Jiao Di stayed with us. I didn't ask her any more questions about what happened. The next day, in a low voice, she told me, "My family doesn't want me anymore. I'm 12 years old now. I just graduated from elementary school. They want me to drop out and work at home. I refused, so they kicked me out." Her eyes held a look of despair and lifelessness. It was a gaze I had once seen in Suji's eyes. "I want to take you away from here," I said. "I can support you to continue studying. Would you be willing to leave with me?" Her eyes lit up briefly with surprise, but the light quickly faded. "They won't let me go." "They won't," she choked out. Why they? She meant her biological parents. Kicking her out was a way to force her to comply. It didn't mean they would truly let go of her as free labor. They said that in a few years, they'll sell me for money. Her voice grew even more despairing. I held her hand tightly, looking straight into her eyes, trying to soothe her emotions. "They won't. There will be a way." For now, Tang Jiao Di stayed with us. Her past environment made her particularly tense and sensitive. She couldn't let herself relax, always needing to be doing something. She didn't dare eat more than her share, and she didn't dare take food from the table. But there wasn't much work to be done at home, which made her even more uneasy. "Do you want to read a book?" When I didn't know how to ease her inner turmoil, it was Suji who spoke up. He pointed to the small study. "There are lots of books in there. You can take one to your room to read." Tang Jiao Di shook her head repeatedly. "I'll just do some work." She was someone who couldn't stand being treated well. Any kindness made her feel indebted. "But it's rest time now. According to our house rules, this is the time for either reading or napping." She was convinced by him. In the end, she took a book to her room. Suji had a way with persuasion. Under his influence, Tang Jiao Di often found herself muddled, but eventually, she would listen to him. In my plan, I was determined to take both of them away from here. But I wouldn't try to match them together. I had taught Suji about the differences between boys and girls early on, so he never stayed alone with Tang Jiao Di in the same room for more than 10 minutes. I seriously considered how to take Tang Jiao Di away. Suji told me he had an idea. After hearing it, I had to admit it had a high chance of success, even if it wasn't entirely ethical. Before deciding to use it, I sought Tang Jiao Di's opinion. She listened quietly and then lifted her overly long bangs. The scar on her face was fully exposed. This scar, it was made when I was 10 years old, and my younger brother used a compass to carve it, all because I didn't give him 5 yuan to buy a toy. Her body trembled lightly. The deep sorrow within her threatened to swallow her whole, but she took a deep breath and slowly opened the festering wound in her heart. That 5 yuan was my reward for reciting books and taking first place in my group. My notebook was used up, and my pen refills were finished. I had planned to buy 2 notebooks and 6 pen refills with that money, enough to last me a month. Her tears flowed more freely now, her eyes filled with despair, as if no light could ever reach them. But in the end, my face was scarred. My younger brother took the 5 yuan, spent it on a toy, and discarded it in less than 2 days. My biological parents took me to a nearby clinic. When they heard my wound would cost hundreds to treat and might not fully heal, they turned and left. I followed behind them, clutching my bleeding face. The wound stopped bleeding on its own, without any medication. In the height of summer, I endured the wound festering day by day. I endured my brother splashing dirty water on my face. I couldn't fight back, couldn't even speak loudly. If I did, I would be beaten with a wooden stick. They genuinely didn't care if I lived or died. She cried and laughed simultaneously, a wild, almost crazed laugh, like someone who had lost her mind. "If I could, I'd rather have never been born. I'd rather they strangled me the moment I was born. I've been preparing, waiting for a day that seemed good enough to give up on myself completely. I dream of leaving this place, leaving them. Even if it means dying, I'd be okay with that." Suji brought over tissues. With red eyes, I wiped her tears away. "Come with me. I'll take you far away from here." Once, I resented my mother, not much, but enough to feel bitter about how her presence in my life was nothing more than 2 faint words. I resented her for the countless times I envied my classmates who had mothers, but all of that dissipated when I met her. I only wanted to take her far away from her nightmare of a past. Take me away from here. Anywhere is fine. I'll do whatever you say. I'll listen to you completely. She was placing all her fragile hope on me, her last gamble. How could I let her down? The plan was to have a group stage a confrontation. Tang Jiao Di's father, hot-tempered and prone to violence, was the perfect target. A few days later, Su Ji found some people to help. A frail-looking child, along with a pair of sharp-featured parents who looked like troublemakers. Surprisingly, despite their difficult appearances, the couple was agreeable when discussing the plan. Once the plan was set, the child appeared in front of Tang's father with a large sum of money. Tang's father's eyes lit up at the sight of the money. Thinking himself clever, he stole it, only to be caught moments later. When the rest of the Tang family arrived, they tried to turn the situation around, claiming the money belonged to Tang's father. But they didn't know that the money had a name written on it in pencil. When this tactic failed, they tried to escape the situation, but the child's parents refused to let it go. Stealing is illegal, they argued, and what he took could land him in jail for years. The Tang family panicked. After their attempts to sweet-talk or intimidate their way out failed, the child's parents made a suggestion: we'll let this go, but only if you give us your daughter as compensation. Tang's parents hesitated. They had always planned to use Tang Jiao Ditto secure a bride price once she was older. But if they refused, the parents demanded an exorbitant sum of money, something the Tang family couldn't afford. At that moment, someone remarked, Tang Jiao Di is already scarred. Who would want her? She's only 12 now, which means 6 more years of feeding her. What a waste. Yeah, who would want a disfigured girl? Even if someone did, it wouldn't be for much money. Keeping her is just a drain. Feeding her, clothing her, everything costs money. With these thoughts in mind, they agreed. To prevent any regrets, all the necessary paperwork was completed immediately. The Tang family sent Tang Jiao Di off like a plague. They couldn't wait to get rid of. One more reason the Tang family insisted on letting her go as her unlucky birth. According to fortune tellers, Tang Jiao Di's birth chart clashed with her father's. Upon hearing this, Tang's father blamed every misfortune in his life on her existence, even wishing she would never appear before him again. On the day Tang Jiao Di left, her father locked himself in his room. She took nothing with her, wearing only a tattered dress that looked like it had been scavenged from somewhere. She glanced back on the tightly shut door of the Tang house, then turned away, lowered her head and ran with all her might. She was escaping her nightmare. That evening, I bought plenty of food from the market. We had a small celebration at home. Tang Jiao Di held her bowl of rice, crying as she ate. She couldn't say anything except, "Thank you." That night, the three of us sat down and made plans for the future. The first decision was clear: we had to leave this place. Although they had grown up here, neither of them wanted to stay. Second, Tang Jiao Di needed a new name. What it would be was up to her. However, before we could leave, we needed to pack the essentials. "I'll carry this. You take the lighter things," I said as I sorted through what to bring. Hearing movement, I turned to see Su Gitaki the things from Tang Jiao Di's hands and sling them over his shoulder. He had grown a lot over the years, likely thanks to slightly better nutrition. At T14, he had gotten much taller. I used to look down at him, but now I had to look up. "It's okay, I can carry it," Tang Jiao Di said softly, "but in our house the heavy work is done by the men, and we have me, don't we?" Hearing his words, I couldn't help but smile. It reminded me of the first day of high school, when I had prepared a giant suitcase for him without telling him that I planned to take a taxi myself. But that day, he didn't go to work. With a stern face, he grabbed the luggage from my hands and personally escorted me to the dormitory building. Unlike other parents who gave endless reminders and advice, he kept it simple, shoved a handful of cash into my hand and said, "If anyone bullies you, I'll take care of them." For convenience in future work and life, I pulled some strings and finally got my household registration sorted out. Tang Jiao Di successfully changed her name, too. Her new name was Tang Xuan, something she had decided on long ago. On the day her name was officially changed, I personally wiped away the tears from the corners of her eyes. "Hello, Tang Xuan, I'm so glad to meet you." "Thank you," she said, her eyes red as she hugged me tightly. After moving to a new city, I wasted no time. As quickly as possible, I found new schools for both Su Ji and Tang Xuan. Once they officially started school, I resumed working. When it came to the scar on her face, Tang Xuan acted indifferent, but I knew she cared deeply. Her sensitivity and insecurity made her hide her feelings. She didn't want to burden anyone. I didn't know how to help her at first. After some thought, I sought advice from a counselor. The counselor, posing as a friend, came into our lives, observing and interacting with us. Through them, I gained insights into Tang Xuan's mental state and ways to help her heal. During this time I received a call from the school. The homeroom teacher said that Su Ji had been in a fight and asked me to come in the office. Su Ji refused to back down. Facing the injured student's parents and the teachers, he firmly insisted he was not in the wrong. I surveyed the room and then stood in front of Su Ji. Teacher, I'd like to understand the cause and details of this incident. What cause and details? Your kid hit my son. You have to give us an explanation or I'll call the police. I'm not wrong, I heard Su Ji's defiant voice behind me. When I turned, I met his expectant gaze. At this moment he was a 14-year-old boy, yearning for unwavering trust. I had been his age once, so I understood. I knew his character, and I trusted him. Even if it had been the old, impulsive version of him, he wouldn't have lashed out for no reason. There must have been a trigger, something said or done. Like the first time he fought in front of me. I later found out from his notebook that the other person had used disgusting and offensive language about me. My trust gave him the courage to stand firm. He had never been one to shy away from trouble. Now, he stepped to my side. The other boys' father, still aggressive, demanded, "How do I know you're not lying?" Perhaps he knew his own son's temper because his tone weakened slightly. Then check the surveillance footage. Who's afraid of who? Su Ji's boldness outmatched his opponent. For a brief moment it felt like the past had returned, but I knew it hadn't. If it had been the old Su Ji, he would have clenched his fists, staring at the man with a fierce glare. The first word that displeased him, he would have acted. Pulling my thoughts back, I turned to the homeroom teacher and principal. Call the police and check the footage. If it's our fault, we'll take responsibility, but if Su Ji is telling the truth, I'll pursue this matter to the end. Dad, let's just drop it, the injured boy said, tugging at his father's sleeve. The father shot him a glare. Maybe this is all just a misunderstanding. How about we let it go? His bravado had noticeably diminished, but I refused. No, both families are here. This matter needs a clear resolution. My child doesn't deserve this kind of treatment. My stance was firm, and not even the teacher or principal's attempts to mediate could sway me. I left the decision of forgiveness to Su Ji and Tang Xuan didn't come to the office. After all, the fight was between Su Ji and the other boy. She had wanted to come, but Su Ji stopped her. As he later explained, the other parents looked like trouble. She's too timid, it would have scared her. One of us was enough. In the end, the matter was resolved with the other boy publicly apologizing to both Su Ji and Tang Xu and during the Monday flag-raising ceremony. Additionally, to avoid further trouble, his parents agreed to compensate me for lost work hours back home. Su Ji recounted the events in detail and explained his actions. That boy had it coming. He thought Xuan was easy to bully, talking down to her, insulting her, and even shoving her. For no reason. Luckily, I caught him. I deliberately lured him to a spot with surveillance cameras, provoked him into admitting what he did to Xuan, and then let him take the first swing. That way, it was self-defense. But self-defense has its limits. If he were over 14, I'd have called the police immediately. Too bad he's only 13. You're really clever, I said, acknowledging how much thought he had put into it. Not that much, he muttered, turning his head slightly, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Su Ji's intelligence shone when it came to caring for and protecting Tang Xu, and he always found clever ways to encourage her to try new things, ensuring she could handle them. He taught her to say no when she didn't want to do something. At his new school, he quickly made a group of friends, despite being there for less than a semester. When it came to friendships, he had a keen sense, knowing who to form lasting bonds with, who to keep at arm's length, and who to guard against. He never bullied others, but he also never allowed himself to be bullied. In academics, both he and Tang Xu consistently ranked among the top. They had long decided which high schools and universities they wanted to attend. These were things I never had to worry about for them. By the end of the first year of middle school, with the help of the counselor and Su Ji, Tang Xuan finally opened a crack in the walls of her heart. She agreed to see a doctor with me. The doctor said that with modern medical technology her scar could be treated. However, a mark would inevitably remain, its depth uncertain. The cost of the treatment made her hesitate. In the end, Su Ji and I convinced her. It was winter break, and since I had to work daily, I didn't have much to take her to the hospital every day. That task fell to Su Ji. The routine was simple. After I walked him through it once, he managed the rest flawlessly. On the first day, he bought a notebook to jot down the treatment's precautions and important details. In it, he even recorded the daily condition of her wound. When the attending physician learned about this, he praised him profusely in front of me. Boys as clever, thoughtful, and caring as him are rare these days. In all my years, I've never met one quite like him. I shared the doctor's words with Su Ji. He looked slightly embarrassed. It's nothing, since it's my responsibility, of course I have to do it well. I didn't know how they first met or how I came into the picture, but now I was witnessing their transition from friendship and familial love to something deeper. Their feelings for each other were cautious and tentative. Even their attention to one another was furtive and shy. They often fumbled awkwardly, a process that's hard to describe, something I'd never experienced myself. I watched quietly, never interfering, because I knew Su Ji would never hurt Tang Shu, and I watched them graduate from middle school and successfully get into their desired high school. By then, it seemed they had silently confirmed something between them. The atmosphere between them shifted, yet they continued their charade, trying to keep it from me. I smiled, choosing not to expose them. I had been in this world for 8 years. 2 years were all I had left. From the beginning, I'd been preparing for this departure. When I left, Su Ji would be almost an adult, and Tang Shu wouldn't be far behind. I planned to divide the money I'd saved equally between the two of them. As for the rest, Su Ji already had the skills to navigate this world safely, and Tang Shu had fully integrated into society, learning how to interact with people. With Su Ji by her side, she would never be mistreated. That was enough. As for me, once the 10 years were up, I would likely disappear completely, but I had already died once. These 10 years, being able to return to my father's childhood, to pull him and my mother out of their abyss, that was more than enough. I knew Su Ji's perceptive nature well, so before my departure I lived as normally as ever, giving away no signs of anything amiss. It was the second year of high school for Su Ji and the 10th year since I arrived. I could feel my time running out. I even had a sense of when I would leave. I had arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, and I would leave at the same time, 5 p.m. That afternoon, Su Ji came home from school carrying a large cake. Behind him was Tang Shu, and when they saw me, Su Ji smiled. 10 years ago today, you came into our lives. Today is the 10th anniversary. Thank you, Su Hen. Thank you for coming into my life and giving me a second chance. I froze, my throat tightening, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. You don't need to thank me. I should be the one thanking you. Thank you for giving everything you had, forcing it into my life so recklessly. I'm sorry I didn't understand it at first, and that I couldn't grow up the way you'd hoped, peacefully and smoothly. Su Ji looked confused. He was still speaking, but I could no longer hear him. The time had come. I had to go. Time froze. The expressions on Su Ji and Tang Shu's faces remained still, suspended in the moment, and my body began to dissipate, bit by bit, floating in midair. I watched them one last time. Yes, the 10 years came to an end. I heard the voice again. Thank you, I said sincerely. After you leave, their lives will continue. They will remember you existed, but your name and face will fade from their memory. You will become a natural part of their past, gone in a way they can accept, the voice said. Thank you, I said again, even more gratefully. My biggest worry had been that my departure would leave them in pain. I had promised to stay with them forever. I was sorry for breaking that promise. As I became a spirit again, my soul didn't dissipate entirely. I hovered in midair, watching their lives unfold. To them I had died, but in a way they could accept. They remembered me occasionally. Speaking of me, every year they visited me during Qingming Festival. I watched them graduate high school and attend the same university. They eventually became a couple. After graduating college, they got married, and the same year Tang Shuan became pregnant. The following year, she gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Looking at the baby, Su Ji looked slightly annoyed. I already bought a little dress, and it's a boy. I chuckled softly, an infinite sadness filling my heart. I had been by their side for 10 years, watching them name the baby boy Su Yang. 10 years passed in the blink of an eye. Then, Su Yang was 3 years old, and once again I heard that voice. It's time for you to go. All right. I felt my soul slowly dissolving, smiling as I closed my eyes. This was enough, more than enough. Here comes the baby, it's a girl. I heard an unfamiliar voice and opened my eyes. What greeted me was the sight of a hospital room. Let me see her. A familiar voice rang out. I turned to see Tang Shuan, her face pale and weak. She looked at me with a contented smile. It's a sister, came Su Yang's tender, joyful voice from nearby. Keep your voice down. Don't disturb the Others, you have a little sister to protect now, understand? This was Su Ji's voice, millimeter. I'll protect her well. His young voice was filled with unwavering determination. The end.